Hello again. I'm continuing my series on genocide in the Bible, and I'm still currently talking about the military campaign, Israel's military campaign against Canaan, or the Canaanites. I want to begin this video by discussing this question: what other general principles of God's governance might shed some light on this situation? If you haven't seen the previous videos, especially the last 4 or 5, I believe this is video 13, I would encourage you to stop this video and look at those now. That way you understand what's going on in the discussion. Beginning here, I want to survey some of the other governance structures that are present in discussing this issue. In the earliest promise to Abraham, in Genesis 12, we read, "Whoever curses you I will curse, and all peoples on earth will be blessed through you." The promise of protection for Abraham and his descendants can be seen all through biblical history, and therefore in the conquest narratives. The Hittites, one of the Canaanites' peoples, perpetrated rape on Dinah, one of Jacob's daughters, in Genesis 34. During the travels of Israel, the Amorite people attempted 2 unsolicited and unwanted attacks on Israel, once by Arad and once by Shiloh in Numbers 21. But the big one was the persecution by the Amorites, Canaanites, while in Egypt. This seems a bit odd, of course, since Israel was being mistreated by the Egyptians during this period. But nonetheless, this was a present factor through the influence of the Hyksos. A dynasty of the foreign rulers known as Hyksos established themselves in control not only of Syria and Palestine, but also of Egypt during approximately the years 1650 to 1542 BC. This is, of course, according to Myth and Mystery by Jack Finegan. Now, if you notice something, the Israelites were enslaved in Egypt during this time. I believe the early date of the Exodus around 1400 BC mark, which would make the 400-year sojourn in Europe from approximately 1800 to 1400 BC roughly. One can be seen then that all the Hyksos reign, or the new intermediate kingdom, would fall in this period. I also understand Genesis 15:13. Then the Lord said to him, "Know for certain that your descendants will be strangers in a country not their own, and they will be enslaved and mistreated for 400 years. To entail this mistreatment period of several hundred years, as opposed to just the years right before the birth of Moses. According to Exodus, after Joseph died, a new king arose to begin the mistreatment. This would make perfect sense if the new king was an outsider like the Hyksos. This would mean that the long-term mistreatment of Israel was initiated, or at least intensified significantly, right after the death of Joseph. Their name, Hyksos, and again I put this in the description box, I may be mispronouncing it. If I am, let me know, corresponds with the Egyptian rulers of foreign lands, but were also understood to mean shepherd kings, so were probably predominantly Semitic Amorites or Canaanites. Again, this comes from Myth and Ministry by Jack Finegan. Myth and Mystery. I keep mispronouncing that word too. So soon after the Hebrews go into Egypt as welcome guests and important contributors and leaders, the Amorites and Canaanites show up and start enslaving and mistreating them, even to the point of infant destruction. Look at Exodus chapter 1. So the Egyptians and their rulers started murdering the infants of the Israelites. It's probably around near the end of the sojourn that the sins of the Amorites reached their full measure, which is reference to international destruction, socially destructive religious practices, and cruel enslavement of foreign peoples, such as the Israelite population that reached close to 2 million at the time, and systematic destruction of infants and babies. And the Abrahamic principle, "I will curse them that curse you," probably started kicking in here. The principle of an eye for an eye. This was a principle of law and justice that said the punishment must match, not exceed, the crime in kind. You can read about it in Deuteronomy 19:21. It was not unique to Israel. It shows up in the code of Hammurabi as well. It was strictly a legal motive for the legal system, and not necessarily to be the rule in personal matters or attitudes. How would this show up in the Amorite-Canaanite judgment? First of all, the Amorites and the Canaanites drove out cultures before them in the early invasions, so they were to be driven out. Remember, I mentioned in the early videos there was actually a very highly advanced civilization for their time that actually resided in the land of Canaan before Abraham. So the Canaanites that were in the land as Israel was marching into Canaan actually had driven out a nation before them. So they had driven out other cultures before them, so they were to be driven out. They caused whole cities to be abandoned, so they were forced to abandon their cities in flight. They won their battles on military strength, so they were defeated by military strength. They destroyed urban centers, so their urban centers were destroyed. They were unreasonable and unwilling to negotiate. Look at Numbers 21:21. God did not allow Israel to negotiate with them. So God did not allow Israel to negotiate with them, except for the Gibeonite deception. You can read about Joshua 9 again, and that was against God's will. The old adage, you reap what you sow, was certainly true in this case. God is not unfair, partial, and does not hold double standards of ethics. He saw that Israel was warned explicitly not to become like the Canaanites, and when they did, they suffered the same fate or deportation. Not only this, but the very second battle in the land, that of, I believe, Ai in Joshua 7, an Israelite kept some of the forbidden sacred images that God judged, and God judged him, his family, and the entire nation for this breach of covenant, just like he was judging the Canaanites. No double standard here and then, or later in the northern or southern kingdoms. Individual actions always affect the fortune of others for good or ill. The nature of the historical community and cause effect and such is such that the actions of one member of a group always affects the others. The decisions of a parent may have consequences for the child. The decisions of a civic leader may have consequences for the citizens. The decisions of an army commander may have consequences for soldiers. The system was set up for good, that we might bless the lives and fortunes of others, but anything good can be twisted into something destructive. In the case of the parents who had the good sense to migrate, the children benefited. In the case of those parents who chose to stay and fight, their children died too. In the cases of city members who decided to act independently of their civic leaders, recommended sanity saved lives. In the case of those who simply followed the leaders instead of information about the Israelites, their lives were lost. The case of Rahab the prostitute is instructive. She rebelled against the civic authority and saved her life and the lives of those who came into her household. Joshua chapter 6, verse 23. The decision of one worked for the good of others, and that's how the system is supposed to work. It's always difficult to deal with the complex relationships and dependencies within the human family, although we rarely complain about how unfair it is for a child to be benefited by the integrity and resources of a good parent. We often complain how unfair it is for a child to be disadvantaged by abuse or poverty of a bad parent. The two go together for good or ill. You cannot even have a parent-child relationship without a significant level of real and meaningful and therefore potentially really damaging dependencies. It's simply inconceivable. And frankly, the alternative to dying swiftly with your parents is not obviously better. It's a close call. In this case, let's suppose the children were under fighting age, around age 12, were spared, but the adults' livestock killed and the home's food stock taken. With the average age of 6, homeless, without shelter, in shock, without food, without nurture, in grief, in terror, without protection from the wild animals, without protection from marauding bands of slaveholders, without protection from each other, without any adult guidance, how long do you think they will last in the wild? The Israelites had no resources to care for them. They were en route or care for them or route them to other nations around them. What kind of slow death would that be? Of course, the alternative scenario is the only theoretical exercise and only meant to show that this issue is very, very complex at what is best. God chooses a different path in most history. The power of parents, for good or ill, is consistently maintained and always displayed before the eyes of us who are parents. We must take this responsibility seriously. There are real consequences and no magic escapes for those whose lives touch family, friends, and followers. We'll pick this up in the next video. Thanks.